Good afternoon. Hypatia, who was she? She was the first woman mathematician of whom we have reasonably secure and detailed knowledge. She's the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, who was a mathematician, astronomer, and member of the Alexandrian Museum. And she taught mathematics and Neoplatonist philosophy in Alexandria, way back in the 4th, 5th century AD. And she's most famous for her brutal murder by a group of zealous monks. And it's doubtful, if that hadn't happened, would we know about her? Well, who knows? Now, if you go online and look for her, you will find a number of pictures. I quite like, it's probably easier to use this, I quite like this one where she's lecturing. There are all sorts. I was intrigued by this one on the bottom left. Can you see that? And she is one among a number of what's called the Theon portraits, which date from Egypt from the 1st to the 3rd century AD. They're rather fine because they all look very individual and all very like normal people, and they're a bit earlier than our time, but they give you an idea of what people looked like then. And the one I liked was this one. She's obviously academic. She's thinking about what she's about to write. I've told you about that, haven't I? It's a little early for our purpose, but it does give us an idea of what she might have looked like. And I thought at first, but she's got a book, not a scroll. She's way ahead of her time. But in fact, they were from the 3rd century ADs, and they did have books then. And when you look at the history of the Codex, which is a bound books, you'll find that they were actually taking over from scrolls in the 4th century AD. So she's up to the minute there. And the modern pictures that you saw, but this is the one I chose because she more fits my idea of a scholarly lady who thought about what she was doing. She's been much iconized because of her brutal murder, as a martyr for women intellectuals, as a martyr for liberated women generally, as a martyr for science or freedom of thought and speech amid a supposedly restrictive Christianity, as a romantic heroine. There are loads of journals and galleries, well, at least 2 journals and a number of art galleries named for her. There's a number of romantic novels. The one that comes to mind is the one by Charles Kingsley of the Water Babies, and even a film, Agora. And I noticed when I was looking for pictures, there are even some knitting patterns for some interesting hats and a cardigan of an interesting sideways construction, which is definitely on my list for next time. But much of what's been written about her, it says more about the writer than it does about her. And little of any of these things, they've dipped in, but they're little of them based on the firm evidence. And one can argue about their artistic merits, but for consideration today, we're looking to see what we can actually find out as fact. So these are the secondary sources I found most helpful. Michael Deacon, now he's written a number of articles on Hypatia, but they're all brought together in the book he published in 2007, which is an excellent book, very readable. There's Maria Jelska, and her book is very, very readable. She's more in the philosophy and the history, whereas Michael seeks to look at the actual mathematics. That's Edward Watt, is a very good background study and tells you a lot about how people taught and how people lived in those days, and says a bit of Hypatia. And if you want the real gory mathematics with the original Greek and Arabic texts and textual analysis, then Wilbur Knorr is a thick book. It's an excellent book. It's one of my treasures at the moment. And my copy belonged to Ivor Grattan Guinness, so I was very pleased to have it. The ancient sources, there's the Pseudo-Lexicon, which is a 10th century encyclopedia compiled from a number of sources. There's the Patrologiae Graecae, which is a similar collection of early Christian writings in Greek. And together they cover the 2 sources that we're going to be thinking about, quoting from mostly today. And that's a guy called Damascius, who wrote Life of Isidorus. And you can see from their dates that they're not very long after Hypatia's death in 415. And there's Socrates Scholasticus, who wrote an ecclesiastical history, and he's even closer to her time. Now, what these guys wrote is, what has survived to us is got sort of holes and bits in it, and what's in the two major collections I mentioned kind of fills in the gaps, and they fill in the gaps with each other, and it's quite difficult to sort out which is what. So, but quite often you quote one and you quote the other. And the other sources, Hypatia had a very faithful pupil, Synesius of Cyrene, who wrote a great number of letters describing what life was like in his time. And then also there's what's come down to us of the mathematical commentaries of her father Theon, and that she made of earlier mathematicians. So what was Alexandria like? There was a complicated political and religious strife. The Christian church is really quite early in its career. It only became official about a generation or two before Hypatia, and it's still sorting out the details of belief. And as with any new endeavor, it had this principle of doctrinal unity. Basically, everybody had to believe the same thing. It's a bit more mature now and allows people to believe a lot of different things, but then you had to believe the official thing or else, basically. And in her time, there was a political bitter rivalry between the Roman prefect or governor Orestes and the bishop Cyril. They were all Christian, but they didn't get on. Now, what Hypatia taught, the sort of philosophy she taught, was Neoplatonism. And what was that? It first appeared in the 3rd century. Ammonius Saccas and Plotinus and later Iamblichus, they wrote on it. And what was it about? Well, if you go back to Plato, thinking of the idea behind things rather than the physical objects themselves, he had this doctrine of the one truth, the one beyond being. And the whole thing was intellectual. You could make it a bit mystical if you wanted, and there was some optional ritual, but basically everybody's Neoplatonism was slightly different. It's what happened to fit their philosophy rather than some uniform thing. It did have 3 elements to it. So there was a unity and a thing called intelligence, which came from that, and a thing called soul, which was more material than the other two. Interpretations vary. Oh, there's a misprint, sorry. And if you went in for the very intellectual sort of Neoplatonism, then it didn't conflict too much with a very intellectual sort of Christianity. And since that was meant to be the official religion, if you wanted to go with the flow, then it wasn't too difficult, if you accepted one, to accept the other. Alexandria itself was founded by Alexander the Great in 330 BC, and it was firmly Greek right from the start, and there was an intellectual tradition that was firmly Greek, and you'll all have heard of the library. And as with the library, it became the world's first centre for learning. It started off as a seaport, but then it was a bit like a large university with lots of different faculties and departments. And it was very cosmopolitan. And Alexander the Great himself decreed that everybody was treated the same, the Greeks and the non-Greeks. And in our time, there were people from all over the place with all sorts of different religions, all living in this one big city. Now we look at the mathematical background, and you'll find there's Euclid, who wrote on geometry, Apollonius of Perga, who wrote also on geometry on conics, Eratosthenes, who measured the circumference of the globe, Ptolemy, who wrote his geography and who wrote on astronomy, the movements of the sun and planets, Diophantus, who wrote on arithmetic and particular sorts of algebraic equations. Basically, everybody you've ever heard of in mathematics had something to do with Alexandria, and then there was Pappus, who also worked on geometry and astronomy. But during Hypatia and her father's time, there was a change of emphasis from the primary research, as these guys did, to conservation and explanation. And this occurs, and it seems to happen, as Alexandria was becoming more turbulent and the museum came under threat. Alexandria was quite notorious in the Roman Empire as being a very difficult city to control. Is there any way of stopping this?
Someone is trying to sort it out.
Okay. Can you hear over this? It is. It's like being the dentist up here. And they seemed to have anything was an excuse for a riot, and it was very difficult to control them all. But as far as education was concerned, Theon complained in an introduction that he had to give a more elementary account of everything, for the majority of his students couldn't understand the basics of it. Now, where have we heard that before? So how do we know when these people lived? Well, Theon describes various eclipses of the sun and the moon, and we know how to date them back to 364, and a minor conjunction of the planets in 377. We know he was a younger contemporary of Pappus, and we know that he had observed various eclipses before that. And so going by all these sort of sums and arithmetic and dates, and when he had to be old enough to write about these things, it's generally agreed to have lived about 335 to 400. He was the last attested member of the museum, and the museum, because of all the instability, was in a decline by then. Now, Hypatia was generally accepted as being between 350 and 375, her being born. Jelska and Deacon, whom I've mentioned, argue for an earlier date, partly through when Theon would have been mature enough to have children, and partly by when her students studied in Alexandria and the thought that she must have been a little bit older than her students. Her death, accepted as March, it was in Lent 415. Some argue for a later, some argue for earlier, but the year is described in relation to the various emperors of the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire and how long they'd been, and Scholasticus says it's the 4th year of Cyril's episcopate. Now, Cyril came to power in 412, so that was his first year, 12, 13, 14, 15, and that seems to agree with all the other dates. She was taught maths by her father Theon, and Damascius says that having a nobler nature than her father's, she was not satisfied with this mathematical instruction, but she also embraced the rest of philosophy with diligence. She was famous in her time as a teacher of philosophy, and Scholasticus, another contemporary source, says she explained the principles of philosophy to her listeners, many of whom came from a distance to hear her. And we know that they came from Syria, from Upper Egypt, from the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. So it was wider than Theon's and included philosophy. She was widely respected. None of the ancient sources, they may complain about her about other things, but they don't question her competence as a philosopher. And unusually for a woman, Damascius says that wearing the scholar's cloak, which was basically a male garment, she went out into the center of the city and explained publicly to those who wished to hear about Plato or Aristotle or any other philosopher that they would ask. She was skillful and eloquent in words and prudent and civil in deeds. The city loved and honored her exceptionally. Those who were appointed at any time as rulers of the city came first to attend her lectures, so that would be when the governor, who was Orestes at the time, came to be governor, he would have come to attend her lectures, and in fact he was very impressed, and he became very friendly with her and always sought her advice in any of the problems he had in his governing. And again, he says, on account of the self-possession and ease of manner which she had acquired through the cultivation of her mind, she not infrequently appeared in public in presence of the magistrates, again unusual for a woman. Neither did she feel abashed in going to an assembly of men, because she was confident and she was respected, and they listened to her advice, and all men, on account of her extraordinary dignity and virtue, admired her the more. Basically, if you have a city that's run by a number of councils and committees, then she was on most of those committees, or they asked her for advice. And yet, attaining the height of practical value and just and prudent, she remained unwed. Indeed, she was supposed to be very beautiful and attractive, and one of those who attended her lectures fell in love with her. He was not able to contain his desire, but he informed her of his condition. Now, Damascus says that ignorant reports say that Hypatia relieved him of his disease by music, but truth proclaims that music failed to have any effect. So what's a girl to do? Well, the truth actually not only embarrassed the ancient people, but it embarrassed the Victorians as well, and Edward Gibbon in his Decline and Fall hid behind the obscurity of Greek in order to describe what she did. And what she did was she, through her, used sanitary protection at him. Well, she waved it at him. Now, it's worth thinking about this because in those days they weren't quite so embarrassed about this as we are. And in some cultures, in fact, the first evidence of a girl growing up is an excuse for what we would call a street party. Here she is, she's growing up, she can have children, the future of the community is assured. And that's precisely what happened to her in ancient times and right up to modern times. She'd be married off, she'd spend the rest of her life either expecting or nursing, and she would probably never experience that thing again until menopause, if she lived that long, because it's a very dangerous process, childbirth, both for the mother and the child. Now, Michael Deacon says that some of this evidence was kept and used as a talisman for successful childbirth, but whatever you think about that, I don't know, but the only people who would regularly experience such a thing in those days would be those women whose lives were dedicated to the church, to the temple, to religion. And the Vestal Virgins of Rome are an obvious example, and there'd be something like that in every big city. And this would be, if it was no longer happening in Alexandria, it would be a memory. So if you experienced this thing and you were prepared to admit it, it kind of put you on a par with a priestess and gave you a religious authority and a religious protection. So whether you think that's what she did, or whether she was fed up with being a woman and fed up with this man, or whether she was just having a laugh when she showed him this thing, the unsavory object, and exclaimed, "This is what you love, young man, not beauty," the silly youth came to his senses and went away and resolved to live life more moderately. So we don't know whether he continued as a student, worshipping her chivalrously from afar, but one who did worship her with great intellectual respect was her pupil Synesius that I've mentioned earlier. He came of a patrician family in Cyrene. Now, if you look, you can see Cyrene there. There's Alexandria. It's quite a long way to come. It's about as far as Damascus and Jerusalem, all the way up there. And he was a great letter writer. About 160 of his letters survive, along with other works. And many are directly relevant to his Alexandrian circle when he came to study in Alexandria, including Hypatia, whom he calls mother, sister, teacher, benefactress in all things. Now, I don't know whether he was unusual in writing so many letters or whether we're just lucky that we have so many preserved for us, but I suspect the former because he quite often complains that people never get round to writing back, which is something that you probably know. So he studied in Alexandria in the early 390s. In mid-90s, he spent some time in Athens, and from his letters, he didn't seem very impressed with Athens. He thought Alexandria was much more stimulating and much better. In 398, he was chosen as an envoy to the imperial court in Constantinople to obtain tax remissions for his country, the area around Cyrene, and he didn't seem to enjoy that either. He spent 3 years hanging around waiting for his audience with the emperor, and at last in 403 he came back to Alexandria, where he married and started a family before returning to Cyrene. Now in Cyrene he spent his time as any young estate manager of independent means might well do, studying philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, everything, farming, hunting, having many a brush with hordes of pilfering Libyans, and every now and then upholding the cause of someone who had undeservedly fallen into difficulties. Someone who's analysed his letters much more than I have says he proved himself quite a good general in arranging volunteers and people to fight these pilfering Libyans off and generally keeping them at bay. There's a nice picture from one of the temples in that area of somebody hunting. I think it's a horse and a dog, and then he's holding something up with his hand. But that's from about Synesius' time. Now, in 410, he was consecrated bishop by the patriarch Theophilus of Alexandria. Now, Synesius didn't want to be a bishop. He said, well, look, you yourself found me a wife and I have a child. How can I be a bishop if bishops are supposed to be celibate? And Theophilus said, oh, don't worry about that. Just carry on with your family, but you're still going to be bishop. And he held out for about 6 months, and then he had to give in. And he writes to his friends, recalling good times as students under Hypatia. He consulted her on philosophy, on the publication of his books. He asked for her help for his friends because she had influence in high places. He praises her highly in his dedication of the gift of an astrolabe to an influential official. And he asks her on his sickbed to supply him with a hydroscope or a hydrometer. He addresses his last letter to her. And indeed, he's rather tragic. He dies before he gets to 40, and not only that, he sees his 3 children die before him, and the oldest could scarcely have been 10, if you do the sums. So it's rather sad, but it's through him that we know that her pupils came from far and wide. They came for cultural training. They made friends for life, like many students are doing now when they're arriving somewhere far from home, and they meet other people of the same mindset who are also feeling a bit homesick, as we did in our time and as he did in his. We hope they make friends for life. Many of them were Christian, and they became bishops, government officials, estate owners with a high interest in culture, good solid members of the establishment. And this training suited their diverse backgrounds and interests. Hypatia's philosophy evidently was one that aimed to reveal deep truths about God, whatever you thought God to be, and the nature of the world. It involved no ritual. It didn't openly conflict with Christian thought. And in a city with a Christian majority, she remained a popular teacher. And these lasting bonds of friendship encouraged them, because they were all in this same community together, in intensive contemplation and personal temperance, which helped them with their responsible jobs that they went into later. So now at last we come to her maths. She wrote a commentary on Diophantus, the astronomical canon, and a commentary on Apollonius. And Theon proudly wrote of the contribution of my daughter Hypatia, the philosopher. And her pupil Synesius mentions the astrolabe and the hydroscope. So we'll start with that. He says, I'm such in evil fortune, I need a hydroscope. See that one is cast in brass for me and put together. The instrument in question is a cylindrical tube, which has the shape of a flute, is about the same size. It has notches in a perpendicular line, by means of which we are able to test the weight of the waters. A cone forms a lid at one of the extremities, closely connected to the tube. That's it there. It's called a beryllium, and it's weighted so that whenever you place the tube in water, it remains upright. You can count the notches at your ease, and in this way ascertain the water. Now, this appeared to stump people for about 1,200 years, until Pierre de Fermat suggested that it was a hydrometer. It's obvious to us, and Synesius knew that it was obvious to Hypatia that that's what he wanted. Now, in the ancient world, if you want to keep in with people, you've got to give nice presents to influential people. And this letter is ages long, and at the end he says, I'm offering you a gift most befitting for me to give and for you to receive. It's a work of my own devising, including all that Hypatia helped to contribute, and it was executed by the best hand to be found in our country in the art of the silversmiths. So we don't know what Hypatia's contribution may have been, but we'll describe the instrument as was known in her time. It's a 2-dimensional model of the sky, basically, often attributed to Hipparchus. Theon wrote about it, Ptolemy used it, and Hypatia taught Synesius about it. So here you are, you're standing in the desert on a nice clear night, and you can see all the stars and the planets. Zenith is what's straight upright. I think this got back to front because the celestial meridian, the North Pole's pole star presumably up that way, but never mind. All this is squashed, projected onto a disk. Now, it's a bit like a GPS. You could use it to do lots of things: the position of celestial objects, the time of the night, the day, the season of the year, what part of the sky you can see at any season, determine the altitude of any object. And you couldn't do all those things at once, but if you knew some of them, you could do the others. Now we have a bit of a diagram here. Your horizon is tipped now, and that's your zenith. And that's where the pole is. And because you're in Alexandria, you're about 31 degrees north. Here's another diagram. Now all the stars that are on the same altitude above you form a circle, and that circle's projected down, never mind, into, this doesn't work anymore. Yeah. Oh, well, we'll have to do it this way. Right, this usually works. Anyway, it's projected down onto what is basically a circle, and as you saw from the next slide, it's all projected onto this nice pocket-size disc of brass. It's got a ring at the top so that you can hang it up vertically, and then you can look at this is called the alidade. It's got a hole at each end, and you can sight through it and decide on the altitude of your star and read it off the scale. That's the back of it. If you flip it over, you get the front, and you have a rule here, and you have what's called the rete, which is just Latin for a net, and all these little curvy lines show you where the fixed stars are, and this circle, which is movable, shows you which part of the sky you can see at any particular time of year. So we'll go on to Apollonius and the conic sections that she wrote about. He wrote 8 books. How am I doing for time? Okay. Okay. Books 1 to 4 have come down to us in Greek via commentary by one Eutocius, and the other books have come, or most of them have come down through Arabic translations through a different route. And it's thought the Eutocius only covered the first 4, the ones we know about. And if you want to know about conic sections, then it's probably best to go and find a good book. But Apollonius introduced the names eclipse, parabola, and hyperbola. The circle's a special case. So if you cut your cone one way, you get an ellipse, and those two are finite. If you cut it a bit further down so that it's parallel to the side of the cone, you get a parabola. And if you cut it at another angle, you get a hyperbola. Now, he showed that they can all be obtained from a cone by varying the angle. He used an oblique cone, that's a straight cone. He used one that was a bit tipped. And he also introduced the idea that a cone really has 2 halves. And if you want to see the whole of a hyperbole, you've got to have 2 halves because it does intersect both of them. Now, the material in 1 to 4 was already known, but the way he arranged it, it became very popular in his version. And he added some material to those, and the other books contain his own discoveries. And the Suda says that Hypatia wrote a commentary, but we don't know any more, except that it's possible that Eutocius, for the early books, had access to it for his work. Now, Wilbur Knorr made some studies of the style and the language, and this is how the style, and also all those little connecting words like and but and then and because. And people have their favourites. So in some places, people might favour some words more than other. And he counted all these up, and he decided in some way that perhaps it was written by an author who had access to Apollonius's original text, revised by an editor, and that the author was Hypatia, and that Eutocius was merely the editor. We don't know. She also wrote on Diophantus, so I'll tell you a little bit about Diophantus, who was sometimes called the father of algebra. And he wrote a series of 13 books. He was the first to recognize fractions as numbers, and he deals with algebraic equations, usually whole numbers for which integer whole number solutions are sought. And different, so both equations that had only one answer perhaps, and indeterminate, which meant they might have a whole series of solutions. And we always remember Pierre de Fermat, who noticed that one of these equations had no solutions and wrote his famous marginal note, which is for a different lecture. Now, Again, there's this what's come down to us through the Greek and what's come down through the Arab world. And so 6 books came to us in the Greek and another 4 in 1968 identified as coming through the Arab route. Now, there are enormous stylistic differences between these two. The Greek is very sparse and to the point. The Arabic is very repetitive. And one of them may be based on Hypatia's commentary, but which? So the arguments for the Greek is, we know that in Book 2 the early problems repeat material from Book 1, but problems 6 and 7 are thought to be later additions because they look like a couple of student exercises put there to some revision of material before advancing to another stage. Hypatia was a teacher, that might have been something she might have done, and then there's that problem 7 contains something that was in Theon's data. The argument for the Arabic root is that each problem finishes with a check that the answer is indeed correct and adds a recapitulation of what happened, the work done. This might be the style of a teacher writing, remember, for a weaker generation of students who need all the help they can get. So you can look at both those arguments and you can make your own choice because we don't know yet. Lastly, she wrote on the Almagest. Lastly, Theon says that she contributed to it, and we don't know what he quite means, so we'll look at it very quickly. It's the only surviving treatise on astronomy, showing the apparent motions of the stars and planets, and it was his Greek title that eventually gave us, the Greeks call it the big treatise, He Megalis Syntaxis, and then it became the greatest syntaxis, Magistri, so it became the Arabic Al-Magisti. And Ptolemy, I rather like him. He wrote this poem, I know that I am mortal by nature, the creature of a day, but when I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro of the heavenly bodies, I no longer touch the earth with my feet. I stand in the presence of Zeus himself and take my fill of ambrosia, the food of the gods. He was really inspired by his observations of the planets. Like many Greek works in science and philosophy, it was preserved for us by Arabic scholars at Baghdad. It was eventually came to the Western world in a translation in the 12th century by Gerard of Cremona. It's one of the most influential texts of all time, and it remained popular. And indeed, we have Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales describing the student, his alms jest, meaning his almagest, and books great and small, his astrolabe longing for his art, his Aughrim stones lay in fair apart, that's what he did his calculations with, on shelves couched at his bed's head. Whether his room was too small or whether they were so valuable he had to guard them, we don't know. But he had everything he needed, everything that the medieval student had, and Chaucer also wrote a treatise on the astrolabe. So, what did Hypatia do? So did she merely prepare an edition of the text? Or is this an approved edition of her father's commentary? And in the reading list, you'll find the papers that argue one side or another. In 1943, the idea was put forward that you could compare the style, and he noticed that a method for long division in Book 3 differs from that explained in Book 1, and it's more systematic. So maybe that was what Hypatia did. And he continues this kind of analysis into later books and sees Hypatia's hands in Book 4, but not in Book 9. It's speculative, it's been criticized, but there's something rather tempting about it. So, very quickly, they had a similar number to us for the number of days in a year, 365, just under a quarter. And if you look at this picture, here we are in the middle, we're the Earth, the sun goes round us. It takes 365 and a quarter days to do the 360 degrees, so you want to work out how far it goes in one day, which is just under a degree, and you can say that Hypatia's example was correct. So we come, the last few minutes, to the last days. Now, while Theophilus was bishop, things were okay for her. He had no love for pagans, he could be ruthless and violent. And remember, there were all the riots between the Christians and pagans. And in 391, some more muscular Neoplatonists occupied the Serapeum, the main pagan temple, dedicated to the Alexandrian patron god Serapis. But Hypatia and Theon distanced themselves from this. They were more intellectual, less ritualistic, and eventually the occupiers were granted an amnesty by the emperor, provided all the pagan images were destroyed. And so Theophilus raised the temple. Here he is, standing on top of the temple, and there's the god Serapis below. He had a hat and a beard. But Theophilus tolerated her school and her products. Remember, they were all good, solid members of the establishment. He tolerated her connections to the local power structures, and then he died in 412. And there was a violent conflict over succession, 3 days of street fighting, and Cyril won. And he immediately set about settling old scores and putting people down. It wasn't quite the violence that angered Orestes, it was the infringement of his civil jurisdiction, whereas Cyril was supposed to be only doing the religious jurisdiction. He himself was nearly killed in a riot by Cyril's supporters. He had the ringleader arrested and tortured, and he didn't survive the experience, and that angered the other side, and the power struggle spiraled. Now, it was one of the books I recommended. She suggests that Hypatia was in Orestes' camp. He was Christian, the moderate city officials were, and they all probably had supported Timothy. She was quite dangerous to Cyril because she had international influence through her students. Synesius was dead, and he couldn't really protect her. And Damascus tells a story of Cyril driving through the city one day, and he passes this house, and there's this happy bubbub of people, men and horses, all coming and going and chatting, and some of them waiting expectantly. And he asks, whose house is that? And his driver says, oh, that's the house of the philosopher Hypatia. She's about to teach. And Damascus says, when he learnt this, his soul was bitten with envy. You can see the green flash from here. Nobody queued up at his house to hear what he had to say. Damascus also said that he determined then and there to kill her, but we don't know. The jury's still out. But definitely rumours were spread that she was casting spells on Orestes and preventing him from being reconciled to bishop, where for reconcile read submit. And Damascus says that many close-packed, ferocious men, truly despicable, fearing neither the eye of the gods nor the vengeance of men, rushed at her and killed her. Scholasticus has more detail, and he says, some Christians, hurried away by a fierce and bigoted zeal, whose ringleader was a minor cleric called Peter, waylaid her returning home. Dragging her from her carriage, they took her to the church called Caesareum, where they stripped her and murdered her with tiles, or with shards of pottery, or whatever you interpret the word that's used there. Not very nice. After tearing her body in pieces, they took her mangled limbs to a place called Kinneron, and there burnt them. And there's always an excuse to paint. I love her hair in that picture. Scholasticus also says they inflicted very great pollution and shame on their homeland. And Damascus talks about blood guilt and disgrace. But they both complained to the emperor. Damascus complains that one of the emperor's officials got bribed. No one was brought to book. Cyril was hailed as the new Theophilus, for he had destroyed the last remains of idolatry in the city, and he was later made a saint. And here's Scholasticus saying, and Damascus, great pollution and shame, blood guilt and disgrace. And one of them says, it wasn't very Christian, was it? And the intellectuals drifted away to Athens. And Hypatia, as often happens when you try to suppress someone, she became more famous and highly honoured than her persecutor. She might not have been so well remembered if she hadn't been brutally murdered. But we know that we owe much to her for what we now have of Euclid, Apollonius, Diophantus, Ptolemy, and others. And I've just got in time, have I? Okay.